Good morning, 7 East. 49, almost at 50, and we'll just barely get past that this week. Welcome to this edition of Free Lepre Radio. I am your host, Mr. Lepre. You are on the air. We are on the air. And you're listening on the air. Our agenda for today, our daily countdown, and number 2, Rebuilding America assignment narration. You have an assignment today, and I will narrate it, but we have to talk about the big news first. Can you believe it? It's our last week of school. We finally got the answer to the question last week when is school going to end, and now we know it ends this Friday. Really? Yes, really. So yes, you may have permission to celebrate. You'll celebrate more 5 days from now, I'm sure. But fireworks, I can already hear it in my imagination. Celebration's already going on. My response to all this is that you still have work to do. And I know you're pretty annoyed, but on the bright side, it's only 1 more week of work and not 2. So my response to you shaking your head in a very sad fashion is me nodding my head in a very self-assured way, realizing that yes, we have 1 more week of work to do. So here's to a strong finish, putting an end to the 2019-2020 school year. I know it's been tough, and many of us are going to be relieved to finally have it behind us. But let's finish strong and put an end to this school year once and for all, just like the security guard did to this mascot. So this is a strong finish. There's a follow-through with the folding chair. That mascot is down for the count, completely knocked out. And we want to knock out the 2019-2020 school year this week, finishing strong so we can feel relieved and have our minds clear going into the summer. It's a really nice swing right there. Play some baseball, just kind of move that chair down. It's a perfect baseball swing. Okay. Our week. This is what our week looks like at a glance. So today you have your new assignment, Rebuilding America Reading Questions. Your final assignment, which I'm just posting for tomorrow, it's not really posting a new form or anything, but I need you to go back through Portal, look in your assignments tab, make sure everything is turned in. I'm going to be grading everything that I have not graded yet this week, which is the last 2 assignments and this new one. So please make sure that you're submitting stuff. As far as grades go, check back at the grading sheet. As I said, it's PDP or NI for needs improvement. And if you're missing like 2 assignments or more and you're doing PDs and everything else, like you still, to get that PD, it's almost like getting an A. So if you're missing 2 if you're just not doing 2 assignments, that's like I'm missing a week's worth of work. So I can't really give you a PD for that. You can get a P for that. And like stuff like needs improvement, that's more like, look, if we're missing half the assignments, I cannot give you a passing grade for that. So check back to the grading requirements if you need clarity on that. But you have a Free Lepre Radio episode every day. This week we're going to end at 53. What a number to end at. Not exactly an even number, but it's 5 and a 3. 5, 3 makes 8. That's even. And then as we get to the middle of the week, we're actually going to be kind of looking ahead. So the last new content comes tomorrow. It's 1877. I told you in the first week of school, that is the year we end in this course. 1877. So imagine we started with prehistory and migrations to the Americas, and now we're ending in 1877. And that's where we pick up off next year in 8th grade. I'm having 3 Google Meets this week. I'm having 1 today. Then on Thursday, we're having a 7 East. All your teachers on 7 East are going to be in the Google Meet at 10 a.m. But I'm also going to do it on Friday. So Friday at 12:30, if you want to just have a final goodbye for the year, I'll be in there. We can have a more relaxed hangout. We just check what we're doing over the summer. The last day of school is always an interesting day. I remember last year we were in school, and as soon as I got out, I went to get lunch, and then I went home, and then just played video games the rest of the day. And I'm sure a lot of you have been doing that already, but now you'll be able to do so without fear of missing any more work. But that is your week, and since it is our last week, it's also our final countdown. I wish I had the final countdown music, even though YouTube would probably give me a copyright strike. 5 is the number of the day because we have 5 days of school remaining. I cannot wait until we get to that 1 at the end. But now, on to the assignment. Rebuilding America assignment. I'm going to narrate the reading for you, so if you want to do the questions while I'm reading along. Be my guest. This is what the assignment looks like. It's a combination of short answer and multiple choice. I tell you where to look in the reading to find the answer. So P1 means paragraph 1, P2 paragraph 2, so on and so forth. And I try to mostly keep it in order. So this is the reading. I'm going to Control plus this. And I'm going to read along and comment. You are free to read along too, or listen as you answer the questions. So Rebuilding America, Positives and Negatives During Reconstruction. African Americans made tremendous gains during Reconstruction. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments allowed former slaves to exercise rights they did not get to enjoy previously. In addition to these points, the government established an agency called the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865, which had the mission of helping freed slaves get food, legal assistance, and an education, among other forms of aid. In the pre-Civil War South, slave codes often prevented slaves from being educated. Now, in the Reconstruction era, many African Americans could pursue an education for the first time. Pause. So I discussed those 3 amendments on the last Free Lepre Radio from Friday, and now you have something new, the Freedmen's Bureau. It's an agency set up to help freed slaves in all these different ways: food, legal assistance, education. Second paragraph. While Congress and the President were often in conflict over the Reconstruction Plan enforced by the Republican-controlled Congress, many Southern states were already figuring out ways to avoid complying or going along with the 3 Reconstruction Amendments. While slaves were freed by the 13th Amendment, many of these newly freed people had nowhere to go. This often meant that they continued to live on their former master's land and work for him. These former slaves would be provided with tools and a place to stay as they farmed the land, but they were only paid with a share of the crops, which they could eat or sell. This system was known as sharecropping, and it often left many African Americans in a situation nearly as bad as slavery, because of how hard it was to make a profit and be independent. Southern states also enforced black codes, laws that restricted the freedoms of African Americans. These laws prevented African Americans from doing things like owning weapons, renting land outside of cities, and putting them at risk of being arrested if they were found to be unemployed. Pause. So even after slavery is over, they're still putting these discriminatory laws in the South to kind of hem in any new freedoms African Americans are getting. So if you are found and you don't have a job, they'll arrest you for it. If you own a gun, they'll prevent you from doing that and they'll arrest you for it. Well, what about the Second Amendment? Yeah, some things are not being enforced equally. And that brings us to the next paragraph, paragraph 3. In order to get around the 14th Amendment's call for equal protection of the law, which guaranteed that everyone would be treated equally under the law no matter their race or color, Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws. These laws were created to enforce segregation, which is the forced separation of different races in society, across the South by forcing blacks to use different facilities, such as different train cars and different schools, from whites. Even the Supreme Court permitted this, ruling in the famous court case Plessy versus Ferguson that these segregationist laws did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as the separate facilities for blacks were equal to those of whites. This ruling came to be summarized in the separate but equal principle. Pause. Now, separate but equal pretty much always meant that it was separate and not equal. So usually these facilities set aside for black Americans were much worse off than those set aside for white Americans, but the court allowed this, saying it's okay to be separate as long as they're equal. That will later be overturned during the Civil Rights era in the 20th century. Next paragraph. When it came to the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed African Americans the right to vote, men, Southern states came up with clever laws to prevent African Americans from voting without directly violating the 15th Amendment. These states passed poll taxes and literacy tests, meaning that you were not allowed to vote unless you could afford the tax or prove you were literate by passing a test. These laws were made to target former slaves who were often poor and uneducated, having lived as slaves for most of their lives. The states that made these laws also realized that many white voters would be affected, so they made exceptions by creating grandfather clauses. This meant that even if a white person couldn't afford the poll tax or pass the literacy test, They could vote as long as their grandfather was able to. And since the grandparents of former slaves were also likely to be former slaves themselves and unable to vote, African Americans could not take advantage of the grandfather clause. So pause there for a second. So remember, sharecropping, I mean, you're not getting paid in money to begin with, and then you're allowed to vote. They say you can't discriminate based on race to vote, but they say you got to pay money to vote, and if you're like already poor and struggling to feed your family, are you going to choose to feed your family or to cast your vote with the ballot? Most people are going to choose to feed their family. And remember, slaves are not allowed to be educated, so they set up a literacy test knowing that most slaves would not be able to pass it. And then realizing that a lot of poor whites would also fit these categories and not be able to vote, they had the grandfather clause. So as long as your grandfather was eligible to vote, you could vote, which excluded African Americans. Next paragraph. When these laws designed to push back against newly ratified amendments didn't work, some Southerners resorted to violence to prevent Black Americans from exercising these rights and living in equality with white Americans. If an African American was suspected of a crime, sometimes mobs would form and execute such people by hanging them without a trial or a chance to defend themselves. These attacks were called lynchings. Violence also took a more terrifying form in the case of organizations like the White League and the Ku Klux Klan. The White League was based in Louisiana and used violent demonstrations and threats to intimidate Republicans and African Americans. The Ku Klux Klan was a secret society formed after the Civil War that attacked and terrorized African Americans, often riding around at night in white hoods, in order to prevent them from exercising their right to vote and other civil rights. Although there were many positives from Reconstruction, many of the negatives, such as the efforts to deny African Americans their civil rights, continued well into the 20th century. This is one of the major reasons why historians generally consider Reconstruction to be a missed opportunity. The end. So that is the end of the reading. So when we're talking about Reconstruction, generally the opinion is that positives were made, African Americans gained a lot out of it, but it didn't go far enough, and in the end it was a missed opportunity, and a lot of African Americans did not get the equality that was hoped for, and the struggle for that is going to continue. So that is the end of the reading. Scroll up if you're reading through it yourself to do the questions, or you can rewind the video to me narrating. But that's going to do it for this edition of Free Lepre Radio. This is Mr. Lepre signing off.